Okay, well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tony Flock. I am a partner with Creative Leadership Solutions, and I'm pleased to be your moderator today for our discussion between Dr. Reeves, Alan Crawford, and Beth Wodecki. Just a couple of notes as we begin. We please ask that you mute yourselves until you'd like to ask a question or share a comment, just to reduce background noise. As you probably just heard, today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website and shared with you via link by a follow-up email, usually within 24 to 48 hours, depending on how long it takes for that recording to process. Any materials referenced today will be shared with you along with that link to the video in that follow-up email. And please feel free to share today's recording with any of your colleagues who are unable to attend. We very much want this to be an interactive webinar, so I will be monitoring the chat throughout. Please don't hesitate to send in your questions, comments, or challenges to our panel as we go through. And my colleague Lisa Almeida will be joining me in making sure that we pay attention and catch those questions. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Douglas Reeves. He is the founder of Creative Leadership Solutions and the author of more than 40 books and 100 articles in education, leadership, and student achievement. Doug and the rest of us at Creative Leadership Solutions provide job-embedded and actionable professional development and coaching to teachers, leaders, parents, and students around the world. Doug.
Well, thanks so much, Tony, and hello, everybody. We're really grateful that you could spend some time joining us. We never take for granted what a crazy busy time of year this is. Some of you are in testing windows right now. A lot of you are at the end of, after 2 years of pretty exhausting work, looking forward to summertime. So the fact that you're willing to spend some time with us, still learning, means a lot to me personally as a colleague. And I just want to tell you that we appreciate this right off the bat. We are incredibly lucky this afternoon to have two veterans and experts join us. Dr. Beth Wodecki is the Associate Superintendent for Secondary Education of the Monterey Peninsula Schools. One of the reasons I think Dr. Wodecki's insight is so important is that this is one of the rare cases where you can take an island of excellence and expand it at a system level. But let's start with Alan Crawford, who began this work in an alternative setting. Alan was named Alternative Education Leader of the Year in California, brings many elements of background and distinguished service to his present position. But what's most important is that Alan has a demonstrated track record of significantly reducing the failure rate in a very challenging alternative school situation that included students with behavioral issues, with chronic absenteeism, and students who had not been succeeding in a traditional environment. So Alan, I want to begin with you, not only with a sincere thank you and welcome, but also the central question that's on everybody's mind. Your kids aren't any better than anybody else's kids. How is it specifically that you were able to significantly reduce the DF rate with your students?
Everybody, really happy to be here. Yeah, I think firstly, what I would say is we had a strong desire to reduce them. So working in an alternative education setting, our job is to help students who have failed classes. And at one point we looked at the data and we realized we had a lot of kids who were failing. And so I think first we had a passion to want to change it because we knew the negative impacts of kids failing. So I think there was a number of things. Key practices that we did that really helped us. I think one, we gathered the data. So we were super clear around which classes were kids failing most, which kids had multiple Ds and Fs. So we knew kind of where we were. Spent a lot of time examining current practice, specifically around grading. So having conversations, and I would say legitimate dialogue. So not me coming to a teacher saying, hey, why do you have so many kids failing? But starting with just, hey, how are you approaching assessment and learning in your class? What type of grading system are you using? And those conversations, eventually, what we surfaced was that a lot of people were using a 100-point scale. And eventually, as we looked closely, and we realized that it is a mathematically inaccurate scale, and we had some really good conversations about that, we changed it. So from my perspective, one of the single biggest things that can be done to reduce D's and F's is you look at the grading scales that people are using, and changing from a 100-point scale to a 4-point scale, I think for us absolutely changed things. And I'm not saying that the change was easy. However, that was big. A couple more things that I wanted to highlight. We focused on an inside out change model. So it wasn't me as a principal mandating that teachers changed. We worked with our leadership team and we started slowly. We found the people that were already had an inclination or were already doing some of this, and we worked slowly and thoughtfully together. We received outside help. So we were lucky enough to work with Lisa Almeida and Tony and Doug. And I say that genuinely because there was coaching that was provided. There was some knowledge that I didn't have that really helped us and our team kind of come together. I think we eventually created an assessment task force, which helped the teachers on our site work with teachers from other sites, work together. Beth was a big part of that. The last two things I would mention are, talked about dialogue. So I specifically remember speaking with a math teacher who was using a 100-point scale, and she had failed a high number of students, or a number of students had failed in her class. And when we looked more closely at the scale, and we realized that there was, between 100 and a 90 was 10 points, 90 to 80 was 10, and so on and so forth, until we got to the 50, right? Or even a 60 to 0, right? Is 60 points, which on a 4-point scale would be a -6. And she kind of stood back as a math teacher and said, wait a minute, like that's not okay. But we had a conversation about it. And I think that was really big. The last thing that was helpful for us as a part of the overall equation is that we looked at articles and we did some reading. We learned on our own and improved our own capacity. I'm going to put in the chat in just a second. It's an article that Dr. Reeves wrote called "The Case Against the Zero." And that was a really solid entry point for me to have conversations with our teachers about how they were grading, because it's, first of all, Dr. Reeves's style is very, it's an enjoyable read. And it makes a really solid point about why this is bad. So those were the key things for us that I really feel like made an impact.
Ellen, before I go to Dr. Wodecki, let me just ask a couple of follow-up questions. I mentioned that there was a significant drop in the DF, and I know you put the data in the chat room, but would you just, for our participants, give us a sense of scale? How much, by what percentage did your DF rate drop as a result of these changes?
Yeah, and maybe I think Tony was going to put it up there. Last time I was on, I got a little nervous in front of the crowd, so I'm going to have Tony post it up there. But I have the. Let me make sure I've got the number there. Tony, and maybe you can put it up there. But for us, we consistently saw. There we go. Okay, so our school is School 1. And so we went from, just that year, from one year to the next, that was a little bit higher than 80%. And 137 does not sound like a lot of Fs, but these are semester Fs. And if you're in an alternative setting, this is a lot of Fs, particularly for our seniors. And you're talking about students who have not been served in their previous students and are kind of feeling the impacts of what I believe to be an inequitable educational system. And so that was big. So what you can see is from 5 years ago to today, an overall 80% increase. And in a little while, I know we'll talk about kind of the bigger picture, but for us, each one of those Fs is huge. It's a big deal and could be the difference between a kid getting their high school diploma and not getting their diploma.
And Alan, I really appreciate you saying that, because one of the things that I think is important for all of us on the seminar to think about is the long-term effects if we fail to make these changes. It's not a 2022 problem, it's a 2062 problem, because kids who do not succeed in school face decades of failure in unemployment, in poverty, in excessive access to the medical care and criminal justice systems. So there is not a more significant issue facing American education than what you've just articulated, and you're making, and what I think our faculties need to hear. This is not just reducing Ds and Fs for one semester. This is a lifetime of impact. One more follow-up question, Alan, and that is, When you mentioned that you went to the 4-point scale, I just want to be clear, that's not exactly new. For hundreds of years, we've had the GPA system in which A is a 4, B is a 3, C is a 2, D is a 1, F is a 0. That's all you're talking about, right? That's nothing new 21st century about it. That's traditional GPAs.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, you're spot on. And I think, so you had actually spoken to some of our teacher leaders, and that one of that point alone helps resonate so that people, you're not bringing, we didn't bring some new fancy idea, right? It's really just, hey, we are already, you all are moving on this 100-point scale, and you're creating an A, which is essentially going to a GPA, which is a 4, 3, 2, or a 1. And so I think that also helped. That context in terms of people embracing that and realizing, hey, I don't have to grade the way that I was graded when I was in high school.
And one of the biggest shifts, I think the big argument these days over grading is over what's called the minimum 50 to avoid that gap between the D at 60 and the 0. That's one way of doing it, but there's always controversy from teachers, from parents, from community members about that. If you want to have a 0, just make it a mathematically accurate 0, where A is a 4, B is a 3, C is a 2, D is a 1, F is a 0. You can avoid a lot of community controversy that way. And I also will argue later on, actually improve feedback and respect for teachers. But Dr. Wodecki, I want to turn to you now, because one of the remarkable things about your leadership is that this is one of the rare incidences where instead of just celebrating an island of excellence, yay for Alan and his teachers, you actually were able to make some of these system-wide applications. That's unusual. Would you explain how you did that, Dr. Wodecki?
Well, thank you. I think it comes down to collaboration. From the chart, you can see we have roughly 4 high schools. Alan is in charge of our alt ed or continuation high school, and the other 3 are traditional high schools. Traditional in the aspect that it's about anywhere from 700 to 1,300 students. Most of the students we serve come from low income, high EL population. So I think that we're pretty representative of a public school in California. One of the things that we started early on is really just working with Alan as we began to find some early adopters about this need for us to create an equitable grading system. I was one of the few early on 30 years ago using a 4-point scale in my student teaching experience. So it's not something that's necessarily new, but it is a huge shift for teachers that come out of a traditional 100-point scale. Alan and I were able to work together just at Central Coast to start to use Central as a smaller school. And yes, they have a lot of challenges here, which they are able to manage, and actually students are excelling in a variety of different ways. But because it's a smaller school site, we were able to pilot a couple of the key components that Alan was talking about. One, really looking at data and having conversations with teachers in a non-evaluative, non-judgmental way of just exploring the grading practices. What are you grading and why? And so we had a foundation there. And then we were able to bring alongside another neighboring high school that had assistant principal there and a couple teachers that were still kind of exploring. So I think from my perspective, it was really looking from the balcony at where do we have some early adopters and some interest in creating a foundation for us to move this entire system forward. So to be able to have some success early on at one site, and then to be able to glean in some early adopters, and then to challenge teachers to start exploring was one of our first steps that we did. And we used a lot of mini articles. I have to give some kudos to Dr. Reeves for some mini articles that like 1 or 2 pages that are just nuggets that we would start some of our assessment team meetings with, our leadership cohort meetings with, so that teachers could have quick takeaways about their learning.
And Tony, if you wouldn't mind, let's just so people again see the sense of scope, how the district was able to take what started with one school and then expand it to the other comprehensive schools. Dr. Wodecki, would you mind just walking us through those numbers so we understand that the other schools you see there are traditional comprehensive high schools and how they reduce their DF rate?
Yeah, so Alan was able to explain that school 1 is our alt ed school. Alan serves about 120 students that have not been successful traditionally in our traditional high schools. School 2 is a smaller school, about 700 students. School 3 is one of our largest schools, if you can believe it. It's 1,300 students, which might not be large from your perspective, but from our district, it's our largest high school. What was interesting there is that school actually, when we started looking for early adopters, their leadership team, along with each of our sites, has an instructional leadership team made up of teachers and other staff members, which is kind of the brainchild or the think tank for making decisions. They decided early on that they were going to go all in. I was a little trepidatious about that, but that's school 3. And you can see that their results off the bat were pretty strong. And then we had some shifts. School 4 was one of our early adopters, kind of partnering with Alan early on. Just some mindsets there that we're really, we really need to slow down and really have conversations with teachers about their grading practices. And helping our own sites own their own grades was a big part of looking at the data. Could they pull the data per department? Could they pull it by teacher? Could they pull it by student? Do they have the time during the day embedded or sacred where we could really look at this data and start to see the different trends? And even though we are a comprehensive unified school district, each of these schools has their own population, a little bit of a different personality. And so trying to launch this across the district was quite the challenge. And you can tell there that we also had a little thing called COVID right in the middle of it.
You know, one other thing, before we go to the next question, Lisa, I'm going to see if there's questions in the chat room that we want to address. But one stereotype, Dr. Wodecki, that you help break is the stereotype is, well, gee, of course, Alan is this bleeding heart over in alternative ed, just like me. And, all we care about are these underperforming poor kids. But what your data demonstrate is that when you reduce the failure rate in comprehensive high schools, that helps every kid.
Right.
That reduces repeaters, that has a positive impact on discipline,
Mm-hmm.
helps create opportunities for new courses. Would you say a little bit about how this helped the entire student population, not just underperforming students?
Yes. I think one of the big grounding points too is understanding the why. Why are we doing this? What is the point of it? And we've also been really engaging in equitable practices as far as pedagogy and delivery and making sure that our students have access. So when we start talking about access, the D and F piece becomes very large, because are students really getting access? Are they really getting access to the best possible courses, college going and career going opportunities, if they're not passing their classes? And so it becomes a giant barrier when you really come down to it. And the why behind that, like, are we grading according to standards? And I don't think we're going to get into that now, but we did shift also to standards-based grading. But it becomes a huge equity issue when you start to look at your data and you start to see certain students percolate up that are not getting access to grade level, college going, or career oriented courses. And that becomes a huge issue as a public educator. So we, really started to look at the data, and it got to a point, I'll be quite transparent here, where there were a lot of conversations, but then we started to look at the financials behind repeating courses and how many students and how much money we were spending for students repeating courses. And yes, there's a psychological, affective, emotional piece about failure and where does that start in our system. But it also comes down to, like, what are you teaching and what kind of courses do you want to be teaching? If our students are not constantly, but if our students are asked to be repeating and repeating and repeating, what Alan sees on his end are students that have been repeating and repeating, and then they're getting to Central Coast or our alt ed school, and then they're repeating it again. It's like, we need to stop this and really pause and look at the why behind it. And so it's not just, obviously students' access should be the imperative for all of us. At the same time, when we start to look at the other pieces that come alongside, including the morale of students and teachers, and especially if you're repeating again that math class with those same kids, like, okay, let's stop and pause and see how we can adjust and pivot for that.
So before I do have some follow-up questions, Beth, but before I do so, anything in the chat room that we need to pay attention to respond to our participants today?
So one request, Dr. Wodecki, if you wouldn't mind mentioning those articles again, and if you could make sure that we've got the links to those afterwards so we can send those by follow-up.
Great. Yes, I have, Dr. Reeves has a plethora of small articles, but I'm glad to send those along. The Power of the Zero is probably the most impactful one that people really grappled with when they started to see their archaic systems that they were perpetuating, and not really even questioning it. We had a lot of aha moments, even within our upper, district level leadership. That was, I think, one of the big leverage points, is just having them have some lights go off about like, well, why do we do it that way? So I think the Power of the Zero is the one that comes to mind immediately.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Doug.
Any other questions in the chat room?
None at this time. Ladies and gentlemen, please don't hesitate to send questions, comments, or challenges in through the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself.
So one clarification, Dr. Wodecki, I just need to make sure, because when you mentioned standards-based grading, I have this little monitor program on my version of Zoom that tests the blood pressure of every participant here, and I could see a little red line going up all around. When people hear the word standards-based grading, they hear controversy, they hear chaos, they hear very complicated report cards. So just to be clear, your comprehensive high schools are still using traditional A, B, C, D, F grading, right?
We are. We have not changed that at all. And I think that actually came from a recommendation from Dr. Reeves and the team, is not necessarily making that shift, but it's the approach to that we have shifted.
So let's just be super clear. Standards-based grading does not mean a 15-page report card. It doesn't mean fruit basket upset. It doesn't mean, oh my gosh, my kid won't get a transcript and can't go to college and can't get a scholarship. Those are all the dumb rumors that surround standards-based grading. All we're talking about is what California has had for 25 years, every other state has had for about 20 years, and that is that we evaluate students based upon their achievement of state standards, not based upon the average of work turned in during the semester. Yep. So you can have standards-based grading and also have traditional A, B, C, D, F grading. I think that's a common misunderstanding. So I just want to reduce everybody's blood pressure on that point. I want to go back to Alan for a moment, but let me just double check. Any questions from our colleagues online, either in the chat room, or if you want to unmute yourself, you're most welcome to do so.
Well, Doug, I'm wondering, Thomas offered a comment. He said we use standards-based grading at his location and then convert to GPA. Are there any pitfalls that you might want to be aware of? And then Lori Jenkins has raised her hand. So after you address Thomas's comment, Lori, please unmute yourself.
So I realize that a lot of us are in secondary ed right now, but let me just tell you the biggest pitfall when teachers say they use standards-based grading, oftentimes instead of using letters, they'll use numbers 4, 3, 2, 1, or they'll use terminology like advanced, proficient, progressing, and so on. And all I can tell you is every parent in the land is going to come into your classroom or into your office and say, yeah, but what is it really? And that's why I just appreciate the simplicity that Beth and Ellen to say, hey, it's A is a 4, a B is a 3, a C is a 2, a D is a 1, an F is a 0. And if you want to have language, you make it super simple. Like an F means you didn't try. A D means you tried, but it's not okay. A C means you tried and you're almost there. A B means you're proficient, and A means you're advanced. Now you can use fancier language if you want, but my experience tells me that the more clear and simple we can keep this, the better off we are. So Tony, please recognize the people whose hands are up.
Yeah, so Lori Jenkins, if you would, please unmute and pose your question.
Hello, everyone. We're working with the school as an SST, and I was just curious, Beth, that as you were speaking, with the school, we're going down the path of grading and examining our practices, and what we're finding is just a cadre of all kinds of things that are mushed together to represent what should be a grade. Did you have a mechanism, a tool, or a process that you used with teachers to kind of streamline what that grade really should represent across your buildings?
Yes, we have seen almost everything. We have seen a few years ago, even prior to our, this journey, extra credit, and you bring in soup cans, which is for Thanksgiving fundraising. That's all really great, but it shouldn't be part of your English grade. And I think we've been really delving into what are you grading the student on? And that's where the standards-based pieces come in. Do teachers understand the standards that are required for their courses? That in itself is a huge, Dr. Reeves was talking about chaotic and messy and all those things. We are still living that mess. We have not arrived from that mess. But at the same time, for teachers to really understand what they're grading and what they're not. So oftentimes we will use non-examples to clarify what it is. And so we have developed leadership teams, content area leadership teams, for example, our English leadership team, our math leadership team, and these are representatives from each of the high schools. So this gets into a little bit of Alan's school was the pilot, and he was working with an assessment team that really started to develop language around what was our belief system, what's our vision as a district. That language actually evolved into our board policy, and that might be a discussion for another time. But at the same time, we had this assessment leadership team that was also part of content area leadership teams. The English, for example, we're in an adoption process. Are we looking at curriculum that is standards aligned? Obviously, but do our teachers know what that standard is and how to assess it? The other piece that we embedded in, which I think was pretty helpful, and I think there's more work to be done here, is opportunities within the school semester, quarter, day for students to show their mastery again, to retake, to have a philosophy that you're not quite done yet. Look, you haven't turned this in. I'm going to make it really hard for you to get an F. Where are some opportunities during the day that we're going to be reassessing that? Or can you show me this in a different way? So at the end of the semester, one of the pieces that we put in place was just an individual learning plan. What are 3 or 4 things that teachers can say to a student? This is what you need to make up in order for you to be in good standing. And so for us as a district to be able to create that space and working with the unions and the teachers and parents to make sure that they understood that these were some opportunities that we're not quite done yet. And so those were just some structural pieces that we put into place. There's a lot more that we're looking forward to in fall 22, but I do think we're making some structural changes so that it can live somewhere, not just talking about it, but it needs to be embedded in the school day.
And if I could just offer 2 areas of very positive reinforcement. Did you notice that Beth said during the day? Because the problem is that a lot of remediation happens way too late. It's either, after a student is in danger of failure and psychologically they think that they've dug a hole so deep they can't get out, or even after school. But a lot of kids who need after school have sibling care responsibilities, have job responsibilities, have transportation issues. So during the day is when the most effective remediation happens. We also know that a cardinal principle of feedback is that it's got to be immediate, like happens with our music teachers, like happens with our coaches. That source of immediate feedback and immediate opportunity for correction is the sort of thing that we ought to be practicing in every class. So thanks for that emphasis.
And we're still working on it. We have not arrived. So I just want to be completely transparent about that.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Wodecki. Bill, you had a question. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, everybody. Sorry about the dramatic lighting. It's just kind of what is. Dr. Reeves, they had mentioned, and this is for the whole panel, I've got a couple of concerns that we're trying to move with our staff. We're doing it over a slow period of time, go slow to go fast. We're trying to figure out, we're trying to do it from the inside out, starting it with our ILT, but there's 2 concerns that we're kind of, it's a fake halo, but thanks. There's 2 concerns that we're kind of juggling here. I work at a very high performing school, historically high performing school, public school, that's been that way for a while. And we've also, what we're trying to do right now is address it in a bunch of different ways. One of them is balancing student achievement with wellness, because, and that's a focus for all of us, I think, returning in. But sometimes, and this is just a gross overgeneralization, but I think it could hit home, and maybe it can help with the wisdom of the people here. When you're at a historically blue ribbon, award-winning, high-winning school, high AP pass rate, all of those things, and we talk about this, and then we talk about trying to help with grading and talk about going from a 100-point scale to a 4-point scale, a lot of people will automatically go to, you're going to water down our curriculum, we're not going to be the achieving school that we have always been. And I don't know how to help well, I do, I mean, I'll figure it out, but I'm trying to figure out, how do we help the teachers understand that we can keep the rigor? We're just trying to include more in the umbrella of achievement. You know, we're trying to include more people in the achievement, and not just the kids who've had the siblings who are at Ivies now, and then the younger siblings are coming up and they're kind of the people who are dominating stuff. We got to make our umbrella and our kind of cape for achievement cover more people. There's that thing. And the other thing is you know, how do we convince them that we can get more fair with grading practices without losing academic rigor and challenge for the kids who really need that? Because we do have that differentiation. A lot of times people want to go from where you're midpoint down, and nobody talks about the other one. So we need to make sure that we keep that as robust as possible. The other thing is that you mentioned, somebody had mentioned the fact that you had done some consulting, some outside consulting, and got them to the point where they had an assessment task force to another school or community that like to do that. What would be the process? And I will take my answers off the air. Thank you, everybody.
Sure. Let me start, because I've actually done work on this very issue of what happens in high-performing schools. And it's very, very interesting. People assume that just because you have fewer D's and F's, that must mean you have more A's. That's actually not the case. Once you define with clarity what A, B, C, D, F means, and you create an opportunity to recover from F's, because it's not just about work completion, it's not just about homework, it's about being proficient, you will have fewer F's. But the other end is equally problematic. And that is when you say, hey, if an A really means something, an A doesn't just mean point accumulation. An A does not mean the argument at the end of the semester. Gee, Mr. Gallimore, how many extra points do I need to get to move from an 89 to a 90, from a B plus to a 90? If you take that off the table and say, what you got to ask is, what do I need to learn and show and do to get an A? Then here's what some California teachers have told me. Some students will say, I'm down for the challenge, I'm headed for the Ivy League. And others will say, well, that's a lot of work. And they're used to, as Dr. Wodecki said, bring it into Kleenex. And the truth is, you can oftentimes, and I've seen this data in science and math particularly, have fewer A's once you define with rigor what an A means. That it's not about points, it's about performance. And I should have said, Dr. Gallimore, what I also meant is, I wrote an article that I should be sure to send you called What Colleges Really Need Right Now. And colleges aren't asking for this illusion of points. You don't get in the dean's list, and you don't get the Baker Scholarship at Harvard with points. You get it with performance. And that's the same is true on the job. The same is true in graduate school. This shift from points to performance is exactly what high-performing, high-rigor schools demand. And that's not what a lot of kids are used to. They're used to playing the point game. But if you really want to prepare them for UC, for the Ivy League, or for that matter, the job market, they've got to make that shift to what do I need to learn and show and do, rather than arguing, gee, can't I make senior partner at the law firm with some extra credit? Not going to work that way. So it is a big shift, but it's a shift definitely toward the real world of college and the real world of work. And I should just say that I'm happy to have these conversations with all of you, but sometimes with parent groups like the ones that Dr. Gallimore is discussing, they need to hear that, because they might have gotten to their level of success with points, but ultimately this really resonates with them. They know that their success professionally wasn't about points and extra credit, it was about performance. And the sooner their students learn that, the better. There's just one more point, and then I'll get off my soapbox and let Alan and Beth chime in. There's an issue here to me of respect for teachers, because it happens every May, like the swallows of Capistrano. Every May, there's one or two conversations that comes to pass, the point conversation or the learning conversation. And in schools like Bill is discussing, it's always about points. How many extra points do I need to get to go from an 89 to a 90? Having nothing to do with learning, it's all about point game. And I think that sets students up for real disappointment when they find out in college and later on that doesn't work. So I think the very clear 4-3-2-1 sets them up much better for that real world. Finally, I would just say that I would trust every teacher on this call to tell me the difference between an A and a B and a C. But you want to know what, colleagues? None of you can tell me the difference between an 82 and an 83, or a 32 and a 33, or more, particularly in the 89 and the 90. Those are all what our AP stat teachers call a distinction without a difference. So sorry for the little sermon, but you punched my button on that one. Alan, I haven't heard from you for a while. How would you add to Dr. Gallimore's question?
I would add just, and I think it connects to one of the questions in the chat from Fawn, but we can certainly go deeper into it. But a whole, one of the key things that I think we followed was the conversations aren't as much about. I know we're talking about grading, right? Because I think that's the easy entry point. But I think the conversations aren't as much about grading as they are about assessment and feedback. And so behind this work that we were doing at our site, we also, we worked for several years on building units. And so when teachers really were stepping back to make sure that they were looking at priority standards, when they were defining what mastery of those standards look like, how they were going to differentiate, how they were going to scaffold, and to Bill Gallimore's point, what they were going to do when they gave the formative assessment, and how they were going to help the students that didn't get it, and how they were going to help the students that did get it. And I think that is a whole world of work that anybody can get behind, because at the core of it, we're talking about teaching and learning, and we're not just arguing about the right way to grade. So within that, those are also the conversations where true conversations about rigor happen, right? So where we're talking about Webb's DOK, or Bloom's taxonomy, or however we're gonna talk about that. But so I would just add that to the mix, is that it's not that grading shouldn't be a part of it, but if we get too stuck on it, then we're really not talking about what is at the core of it. Is what do our teachers want our students to learn, and how do they know if they've learned it? So that's what I would add to this conversation.
Beth, how would you address the needs of high achieving students and high achieving schools?
We also have students that, we have an IB school, we have a really strong AP program. And so I think we're fortunate to have a wide variety of students as well. But I do think it can be a challenge. And I think, just to reiterate Dr. Reeves, keeping things simple and making sure you're not messing too much with that AB, outcome, but really focusing in the learning. And what we realized too is that we had some really rich discussions on students that know how to do school well. And what does that mean? They're participating, they're looking at you, they have some answers, they're well behaved. But what about students that maybe this isn't their traditional approach to the learning? And how do we explore those other ways of showing learning or engaging in that way? So getting again back to Alan's point about what are you learning and why, and how invested are you from a teacher and a student standpoint, is still the work that I think that our district is going to continue doing. Do our students really, can they advocate for themselves? Can they do they know what they're learning and why, the relevancy behind that? And I do think that as students grapple more and really engage in their own learning, that they're actually better prepared to compete academically at some of our high performing schools. I'd also question, we have spent a lot of times with parents. I did a town hall with our parents, explaining the shifts in the grading and what it means and what it meant. And it's an ongoing process, but at the same time, I think when parents realize some of the key components of the transcript isn't necessarily changing, the way your student's going to be engaging in the learning will change. And students that are doing well, we actually have seen, fewer A's, but we also see people grappling a little bit more. And I think there's more authenticity to the learning. But those are some really good questions to ask yourself, especially with your district, depending on where you're coming from. But I think too, just having that communication with all stakeholders, because we also had communication with our board and presenting the disparity in the grading practices that we were seeing. And so just chunking this bit by bit to make sure that you're hitting all your stakeholders, and it'll happen more than once. I think I presented to the board probably 4 times.
I hope everybody heard what Beth said about the line of self-advocacy. That's one of the things that I heard when I interviewed college professors, because I know our parents mean well, including the parents of very high-performing students, because after all, they had high-performing parents. Look how well they turned out. But the problem is, when they are the advocates for their students, they are robbing them of a core skill to survive at the collegiate level, and that is self-advocacy. Because unless they plan on moving into the dorm room with their kids, and I'm not making this up, college professors tell me about moms who are calling the professor to complain about grades, and that is not the key to success. So we have to build in what Beth said about self-advocacy. There's one other thing, Bill, that I just want to add that is in the best interest of everybody. Every time, and I know let me get really specific, a school of 1,700 students in California, as a result of the very things we're talking about in this call, reduced 3 sections of repeaters, added 3 sections of electives and APs. If you want to really appeal to those AP-driven parents, the way you get more AP classes is to reduce the sections of repeaters. And by contrast, what I've seen are other schools that are not doing this, that are clinging to failed grading policies and are adding sections of repeaters, and as a result, cutting electives and cutting APs. So this is one more evidence for the policies we're talking about here really help all students, including high-performing students. And remember, it really makes an A mean something. One little footnote, this is probably sensitive for all of us who are parents of seniors, but let me just tell you this. College acceptances just came out in the last few days, typically on April 1st. And all of us, anybody who thought that they had college admissions figured out is lying, because it is alchemy. It is not this parents who say, well, if I do this, then they'll get that. We all know now of a bunch of 4.0 students who got rejected by Michigan State, and kids who had less than a 4.0 who got accepted by Princeton. There's a lot of differences, not just grades themselves. Grades are important. I acknowledge that. And the UC schools, of course, and many other schools no longer using a traditional standardized tests. So that means there's a lot of other things that our children are doing in terms of recommendations of teachers, in terms of extracurricular activities, service, leadership, creativity that go into competitive college admissions. So if we are leaving the impression that a 4.0 greases the skids to the Ivy League, it just isn't true. And you've got evidence in the last 6 days that shows that.
So Doug, a question for the panel from Fawn. She's curious as to whether either Alan or Beth, if you've seen a shift as teachers, shift in the way teachers plan for rigor as well as essential learnings.
Alan, one of the things that I've seen in CTE is that they're super specific about that. Would you shed some light on how they're being explicit about rigorous expectations?
Yeah, so one of the big things too is, as we were kind of within this process, and also just to recap what I said earlier, I think when engaged in this work, essentially when teachers spend more time thinking about teaching and learning, we're going to get better rigor. I mean, it's more complex than that, but I think more intentionality around planning is going to be better instruction all around. And I think our CTE teachers have worked when we start, and again, not even talking about grading, but assessment. So watching our culinary teacher create a really high quality rubric around, a unit on, grains and legumes, right? So different assessments that teacher has done, including we have a patient care teacher who's done some phenomenal work and has really also wrestled with, how do I have a 4-point scale if there's skills that kids either get it or they don't, like taking somebody's blood pressure, right? And so for us, what we found is that I wasn't the one who had the answer, right? I think, but our work gave her the space to wrestle with the question. And she, as the content expert, was looking at the standards, thinking about, again, just truly assessing her students' knowledge. And she has done some phenomenal work in her CTE class around making those determinations, on that scale.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I think CTE can really be a model, because you don't get 80% if you return from a welding class with 8 out of 10 fingers. You do it or you don't. And similarly, I've seen science and core teachers really crank the rigor up. Okay, you got your A, you got your AP 5. Now let's submit an article for publication. Okay, you got your A in music. Now let's see a piece of original music that I can literally record and put on YouTube. I'm seeing really creative things, getting, publishing for publication, creating experiments that are submitted to NASA, things that are way beyond merely getting an A. That's a sort of redefinition of rigor that I think really motivates teachers and students and makes them think, I'm here for more than just point grubbing. I'm here to really demonstrate my expertise. Beth, what would you add to that?
I would agree. We're not quite there yet, but I think when teachers know what students know what they need. We're really putting some power and value into the classroom, and that's where the real magic happens. When we're able to meet those pieces, we're able to go for extensions that maybe we haven't even considered. When we talk about building our master schedule with repeating again the Spanish class with the Spanish speaker, Spanish 1 again 3 times, we're locking ourselves into these self-built boundaries that we're not able to explore these other options. And so to be able to streamline that, and that's kind of where we are right now too, is with the standards-based grading, to be able to streamline what do students need to know. And then there's some freedom in that to be able to explore these other possibilities, not just within the classroom, but within your master schedule as well.
Well, we're at the 45-minute mark, and I'll honor any other questions that come up. I do want to notice something, colleagues. I was going to ask both Alan and Beth about barriers, but did you notice that both of them didn't talk about my way or the highway? They both talked about identifying excellent practices and building from the inside out. And that is the reason I've had excellent relationships with unions, including very, very tough unions, when they know that they're a partner in this process, not simply having something done to them that they've seen 100 times. Every educator benefits from a lower failure rate. Every educator benefits from better classroom climate. Every educator benefits from better discipline, also associated with lower failure rates. So it's a completely legitimate question for people to say, hey, what's in this for the teachers? What's in this for us? And the truth is, there's a lot in this for us when we reduce the failure rate and create more opportunities. The class I've always wanted to teach, but I couldn't because I was doing 3 sections of Algebra 1 repeaters. I think we have to be completely open to that. Tony, is there anything else in the chat room that I need to attend to before I ask Alan and Beth for concluding remarks?
I think we're up to date, Doug.
Alan, how would you, what are some ideas you'd leave our audience with?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is if you join this and you're looking to, you're passionate about reducing the number of kids that are failing classes, please do that. Dr. Reeves led us through this exercise once, and essentially what we did, and I later did it with our staff, is we put up a sample student and we put a variety of scores, right? Like a test score, a quiz score, some missing homeworks. And we first said to everybody, hey, what are the differences between kids who get A's and F's? And so everybody's like, attendance, motivation, their home life, and so they put it all out there. And then we do this exercise where we say, okay, this, same kid, same scores. And essentially we say, what grade would you give this kid? And every time that I've done it, or the first time we did it and every time since, everybody gives the kid a different grade. And so the difference is not the characteristics or the home life or the whatever, socioeconomic status. The difference is the grading system. And so I think, one, our kids deserve us working on this. 2, I think we need to be really thoughtful, and again, not just argue about grading, because I think it is something that people feel very attached to emotionally, but really just bring it back to teaching and learning. And that at the core of it, what we're talking about is clarifying with our standards what we want our kids to learn and being intentional about that, and then providing feedback on that. So I would say, really, if you're drawn to this work, please stay with it. Our kids need it. And 2, just the long-term structure, the grading structures and the structures that are in the classroom really, really matter. It's not those characteristics. I mean, of course, if you don't come to school, it's really hard to pass your classes. However, when kids are graded in totally different ways, and that's one of the main reasons why they're failing classes, that's not okay.
Thank you. Beth, what thoughts would you leave us with?
I don't know, Alan did such a good job. I think, just to really take a look at your data. I know that's not super exciting. And people, when they start thinking about equity and fighting the good fight, they're not necessarily thinking about grading and assessment. But my charge is we need to look at it. And if you're not looking at your data, and your teachers aren't looking at their data and knowing what they're giving, and students don't have an idea of how to get better, we need to start somewhere. And so I just reiterate, it's been probably the most positive and most challenging experience of my career, and it's been so satisfying. And it's not something that you do in isolation. You need to bring do your reading, bring teachers alongside, start somewhere. I mean, we started this process and then we shifted into distance learning and a pandemic, but we've kept it in the forefront, and we still have work to do, but we started. And I think that's the key point. It's just don't wait. Don't say it's too hard. Find your opening and take it.
And just an affirmation I would offer to both Beth and Alan, when you hear Dr. Wodecki talk about looking at data, one of the things that distinguishes them is that they were looking at causes, not just effects. It's easy to look at data, things like number of failures. It's a lot more challenging to say why, because sometimes I'll say, well, why is that? Well, and like, you heard from Alan, well, it's rotten home life or lack of attendance or bad discipline. The number one cause of D's and F's bar none is missing work. And so once we understand what the underlying cause is, then, as Beth said, let's look at what we can do during the school day to address this issue of missing work. Not just lowering standards, not pretending it's not important, but figuring out better ways to get the work done in increasing the probability of student success. That's good for all of us. Finally, I will just say that I have, it's very kind of many of you to mention some of the articles I've written. I will not impose upon you a bunch of those, but I think what we will do is we'll just put together a collection of maybe 3 or 4 of the most cited articles on this subject, and including not just about grading, but maybe how to make change happen effectively in your school. And we'll put together 3 or 4 of those. By the way, all of our research is free to copy, free to distribute. So if you find something useful, please, for goodness sake, take advantage of it and share it with your colleagues as well. Thanks so much for your time, everyone. I really appreciate the robust discussion. Hope that I'll continue to have conversations with you, both individually and perhaps at your school sites as well. To my colleagues, Tony Flock and Lisa Almeida, thank you so much for your support, and especially to our panel, Beth Wodecki and Alan Crawford. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the day.